Walt, it's alive. It happened. Tesla launched Robotaxi on the public roads in Austin for a very cute and cheeky fare of $4.20. No matter the distance, no matter the time, it's still $4.20. The autonomy markets are heating up, but the last 2 weeks have been a tremendous 2 weeks for both Waymo and Tesla, and now Tesla has officially entered the robotaxi markets. Talk about timing, Walt. We couldn't have picked a better time than now to launch Autonomy Markets. We're cruising, we're getting feedback, we're incorporating that feedback into our show every week, so please keep it coming. But well, let's start with Tesla. June 22nd, Austin. It happened. It's real. What are your thoughts on the launch of Robotaxi?
I mean, they hit this milestone. I could, and we've seen evidence, as I think we talked about last week, plenty of videos on X and YouTube. I have to say, I could do without some of the gushing coverage so far. I mean, it kind of reminds me of this piece that we do for Lightshed. Great quarter, guys. Great quarter, guys. Like, relax. Like, give yourself a measured view. I'm not sure how you can claim a ride in these Teslas is better than Waymo. It's silly hyperbole. It's not productive when you're trying to build up expectations as a broader public gets into these cars. Waymo feels like a great ride. That's why I think it should price as a premium service. And that's how Tesla feels. You know, when we were out in California last week doing some of these driver in robotaxi tests, of course, yeah. And I said at the time on the past podcast, it feels like Waymo. At some point, there's a diminishing marginal return. How can it feel incrementally better? But I digress. It's fine. And obviously, we look forward to getting to Austin and testing it ourselves, and hopefully, give a better kind of sense of, and a more balanced, I guess, sense of kind of what's going on there. There was, as I think many people should have expected, some initial glitches that were there. And on the very first day of the launch, Uber stock was up, or day after, I guess, 8%, whatever the number was, because there was one video specifically that many people were focused on where the car was trying to make a left turn. I've seen certainly plenty of videos of Waymos doing the same type of thing in earlier years, not to not to do like a whataboutism or take away from the fact that should be called out. But I think, it just kind of underscores the focus that Tesla goes on. So on one hand, I'm going to chide, some of the initial coverage as being too gushing. And on the other hand, like, I'm going to chide those that are like overly focused on, some initial glitches on day one of where this product is. What were your thoughts on some of these early videos?
There was no middle ground in any of the coverage. It was one extreme, it's the greatest thing since life's bread, and the other extreme, it's the worst thing since the invention of time. It's just there was no middle ground. So I'm looking forward one day to getting in the vehicle for our listeners and viewers and giving a honest down the middle opinion, because I don't feel that there's been any true honest coverage yet.
I mean, with that said, like, there are raw videos. You can basically turn off the sound, right, and look at the videos. Certainly some could be edited. But the bottom line is you have a car that's generating revenue and there's no one in the driver's seat. I mean, there's still some online debate about, the person in the car as well as kind of who's sitting back, in the network, and in terms of the safety driver or the remote safety driver that exists. And specifically, Phil Koopman, who I think has generally been, critical. I actually had a comment on his post because he's giving all these like basically biased negative reasons on why that driver's there, leaving out one that I think we addressed last week, which is having someone in that passenger seat because of the scrutiny of Tesla and Elon and what crazy things, some bad actors, might play. And I think at least Phil acknowledged my comment and said, yeah, that's obviously could be one additional one, that added some like word salad after that I didn't quite understand. But I mean, I think, that person in the passenger seat obviously acts as greater safety. And it also underscores, I think, the culture of safety views that I've expressed on this podcast, where I think that people are overly negative about where they think Tesla's culture of safety is. And I think putting someone in that passenger seat just shows that they do have a culture of safety, right, at this stage in their rollout.
Listen, no matter any which way you slice it, dice it, cut it, it's a monumental move. There was not a human behind the steering wheel. Optimus the robot was not behind the steering wheel. The technology works. Learning to walk is hard. Learning to have a car to drive itself is hard. But what we've seen from all of the videos, despite all that's called the chattering class on both sides, and then Mr. Koopman, Mr. Negative, it works. It's a product that works and it's going to scale. You rightly said when Waymo launched, there was a lot of issues initially. When Cruise launched, there was a lot of issues initially. What happened? Just same as a child, they grew out of that. And Tesla's going to do the same thing, but having that individual in there, yes, because you're going to get a lunatic that would try and do something, I'll say it bluntly, stupid just to get on the headlines, because as any individual that works in the media business will tell you, Tesla headlines sell ad dollars. And so you have to take that account into it, that these people, they're putting these bombastic headlines out there to sell ad dollars at the end of the day. That's truly what it's coming down to.
Grayson, you bring up, I think, an important point in terms of Waymo, having some of these issues in the early days. What Waymo supporters would tell you is like, okay, that happened 5 years ago, and that underscored why Tesla is 5 years behind. And I think, look, I get it that they did do that years ago, but that just assumes that the pace of change is the same. And I think Waymo themselves has effectively acknowledged that the pace of development is now faster. At Google I/O, which I attended to see Dimitri speak, and they kind of talked about this and using simulations and using AI, and they had that white paper that came out at the end of last year that we've discussed on Autonomy Markets. That is a new technology, and they're leveraging AI to move quickly forward. So yeah, I mean, Waymo is ahead today. The question is, how do you define that length of time of where Tesla can get there? And I think the more important thing is, like, when you get to that point, like, it's not like Waymo is a profitable company with, cars at scale with a low cost. In the time it's going to take Tesla to have their cars perform, like Waymo is performing today, where will the cost structure of these two companies be in terms of, the cost per mile and the underlying car cost there?
From an economic standpoint, based on what we know of publicly available data, the cost of the Model Y versus multiple analyst reports, the cost of the Waymo vehicle, Tesla will be ahead there. But the thing that harps on me, and you're a European football fan, and it's football. It's not, we have American football, we have European football. It seems to me that the Waymo fans are one football club, and the Tesla fans are another football club, and they get in this heated rivalry where there is no middle ground to really understand this. So I've thought a lot about this, and I'm going to ask you this. When Tesla publicly reports robotaxi revenue, at some point they're going to report it. I believe that they'll break it out and they'll report it. Does that force Alphabet's hand to break out that revenue at that point, because the market, and then does that become the measuring stick, not the technology, but the revenue?
I don't think they're going to have material enough revenue, certainly not this year, probably not even in 2026 or 2027, for them to break that out. So I don't think that that's a near-term assessment. And I want to push back on what you just said, which is like, oh, the Y is cheaper. But I'm talking about, like, not today, Grayson. I'm saying whenever Tesla gets to Waymo, in terms of functionality, let's assume that's 18 months, just making up a time frame. So don't come at me if you're Tesla and you think it's 6, and don't come at me if you're Waymo if you think it's 3 years from now. The question is, where will Waymo's cost structure be then? So you can't just assume that just because they're spending whatever the number is, 150 grand, again, don't know the number, but probably in the ballpark, that within 18 months or 3 years, whether it's the Hyundai deal or new OEM relationship that they're announced, that they will also drive the cost of those vehicles down. So I think it's a good debate between these two companies. One needs to get the cost structure down. The other one needs to get, I think, better performance in terms of their car and just expansion. in the network.
The Hyundai deal is going to be very interesting. I'm very bullish on that for Waymo's perspective as that ramps up in scale. And you're right, the costs are going to come down. The one thing that you and I can both agree on, not all of our viewers can agree on, but you and I can agree on that Tesla and Waymo are the two leading companies in the development of robotaxis today.
Sure, and we'll get to this later, but I think there is a market out there, whether it's Neuro or Wave or May Mobility, that if I'm going to say that, with the new technologies, that maybe the gap is not between Tesla and Waymo is not 5 years, then that also applies to Wave and May Mobility, Neuro, and others that are also developing the technology. We are open, to seeing, because I've done technology for a long time. I can see how, the leading company is not necessarily the winning company, and timeframes that have been expressed are not exactly. And the same applies to Aurora on the trucking side of things, where there's a view that they are years ahead. I want to go back though to this safety driver or the remote driver, because this seems to be an area Phil Koopman gets a lot of kind of attention, and he's like speculating, like, oh, I don't know, is there a safety driver? I think I see a wheel back there. But I mean, if any of our listeners of Autonomy Markets know from however many episodes, 4 or 5 episodes ago, yes, there is a remote driver with a steering wheel, and it's a 1-to-1 ratio. That is my strong, view that is how it's going, and there's been additional evidence of that. I don't think there's been any hiding from Tesla's standpoint about that being the case, and that's not some big scandal. Like, yeah, it's clear that Waymo doesn't have 1-to-1 scaling. They've got people that, interact. I think the view on Waymo, however, is that it's only when this car gets stuck that some, remote assistance person draws a line to get them out of there. No, I don't think that is not the system. I've had a conversation, at Google I/O with someone, Waymo specifically, where they're talking about how you can be in the middle of a ride. They see something that maybe the autonomy or the autonomous system doesn't know what to do. A remote assistance person gets a pull down menu, makes an adjustment. It's possible that when you're in that car, there's been, someone that's a human that's taken an action that you never even feel. So there's been those situations. I don't know. And by the way, you know why we don't know? Because Google doesn't report this. So when there's these discussions about how far one company is a front of or behind, provide us the data. Like, those that are supporting that Waymo's so far ahead, what is the ratio of these remote assistance people, humans, to the number of Waymo cars on the road? What are the interventions that they're doing as I've just described them? What are those per mile? Like, provide this data, because when you're shooting against a ghost where you don't actually have reported data, I think that's a bit unfair. No question, Waymo's ahead, but let's get some sense. And then the view obviously is like, clearly Tesla, is not going to scale until they move to the next step. So we'll keep an eye on that in terms of, when Tesla changes those remote safety drivers.
The fact that Tesla launched without a driver in the driver's seat is a monumental moment. The next step before we even get to remote safety drivers, when they remove if you want to call it the safety attendant. That's going to be an interesting move. That's going to tell me that they're very, very confident in the current state of the technology.
100%. All of these things, which are currently criticisms, then become positive catalysts. Attendance out. We get indication that the safety driver is 1-to-3. Meaning that, the remote driver. We have to get our terms on that. We got to come up with better terms for this. Remote driver is 1-to-3. Remote driver no longer has a wheel, and it goes to kind of the early Waymo days when you're driving, when you're drawing a line. Like, these are all going to be steps along. But look, from an investor standpoint, perhaps this gives a little bit more reality check in terms of like how Tesla rolls out. Again, if you're a regular listener to Autonomy Markets, our view is not that there's going to be some switch that gets flipped and all of a sudden every Model Y all across the world is going to be autonomous in 2025 or even in parts of 2026, right? We talked about how markets will launch, perhaps in clusters if there's similar markets, but this will be a methodical, in our view, approach to how Tesla continues to expand in the market.
And the other thing that our listeners and viewers need to watch for the amount of Tesla insurance licenses that they start getting granted at the state level. They're around 30 states right now. So they're going to need to have Tesla insurance to be able to operate that. So watch that. That's another indicator as they start adding more and more states to Tesla insurance.
Let's go back to the incident, if you call it an incident, right? The way it's been hyped, it's like someone got hit or a car got hit where, you saw that wheel shake, which I'm familiar with. I've had that happen with my Tesla, and then there was an article about that, and it was more comically about driving 34 in a 30-mile-an-hour area. Like, okay, if that's the case, I'll start taking videos of my Uber drivers. Bottom line, though, Grayson, all that really matters here is NHTSA actually going to do anything to shut this down based on that quote unquote investigation? Like, what is your view on NHTSA's role from what has happened in this first week?
Point blank, NHTSA will not shut down robotaxi. NHTSA will not shut down robotaxi.
I mean, well, let me again push back on that. If Tesla rolls over somebody, like blows through a red light and rolls over somebody, they're going to shut down robotaxi. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but my question is, from what has happened so far, you're saying NHTSA won't shut down robotaxi, but to state that they're never going to shut them down, obviously you can't know, and that just assumes that there's not going to be some type of tragic accident.
At the current state of the way Tesla's operating, NHTSA will not shut them down. No, and I stand by that.
Okay, that's fine. I just want you to clarify that, because when you I appreciate the simplicity in your first answer, but obviously, some people are going to read that as like, oh, that means Tesla can do whatever they want, and NHTSA is never going to do anything. And I don't think that is certainly the role that NHTSA will play.
No, and I want to hammer on that, because you're right. The bows and arrows are going to come out. NHTSA is a great organization. NHTSA is an organization, a governmental entity that saves lives, that prioritizes safety. NHTSA has had some fantastic administrators over the years that they care about one thing, and it's making our roads safer. It's a great organization. Does it need to innovate and speed up? Yes, but it's a great organization that it has the clear mission of making our roads safer.
I'm guessing that if any conversation that occurred between NHTSA and Tesla, if the feedback they got from Tesla was like, go climb a tree, and they weren't, acknowledging and providing what their game plan was in these different scenarios and addressing the concerns, then there'd be a leak, right? We will see a press report in the next week or two, like, oh, Tesla came in and said, like, don't worry about that, and NHTSA's not going to do anything. There's going to be a leak. I think the reality is they probably came in, talked about what the issues were, how they're going to address them, what the risk factors are there. And the fact that NHTSA didn't move forward is probably good signal, that they're satisfied with those responses.
For someone to sit here to speculate about the Tesla NHTSA relationship, you have to understand there's a direct line between Tesla and NHTSA, and there's ongoing conversations. Not all those conversations are made public. We don't know what they talk about, but we do know that there's a direct line. Every robotaxi manufacturer has a direct line to NHTSA. Every OEM has a direct line to NHTSA. What happened in those conversations? We don't know. We might never know. But we do know that there is a ongoing communication.
So I guess the question is, what's next? Like, if you're Tesla, right, and you're aware of these minor glitches that have happened so far in the first week, typical, I think, for early rollouts, even though they've done some level of testing ahead of time. What's next in terms of the expansion in Austin and maybe some of these additional markets?
What do I think is next, or what do I think moves the needle? Two different scenarios.
What do you think's next? Like, what do you think happens from here? Now, you've seen a couple of videos. We have not experienced it yet directly. When do you think Austin expands their ODD? With California seeing this, and you're going to have people pointing to a couple of video snippets here and there. Does that make it more difficult to launch in California? If so, do they pick a new market? Just play out for me the next 6 months in terms of Tesla's expansion.
In terms of Tesla's expansion, it's all going to come down to the big, beautiful bill, but we'll get into that later. When I look at in Austin right now, it's been publicly disclosed there's 12 vehicles. We're recording at the end of June. I'll say by the middle of July, 20 to 25 vehicles there. I'll give you a number 22 to 23 to be exact, somewhere in that time frame. As we go into the middle of August, I could see a 15, 20, 25%, maybe 30% increase in the ODD. By October, I see Robotaxi in downtown Austin. And then I'm going to go out on a limb here. I'll say by the end of the year, they're picking up at the airport. So by the end of the year, you're going to go from Giga, that's up to the SH-130 freeway, toll road, all the way to downtown. I don't know if they make it up to the University of Texas, Austin, but I think you're going to see a dramatic expansion of that ODD by the end of the year. As it relates to California, that's going to come down to the big, beautiful bill.
I mean, I wasn't expecting you to be that specific, Grayson. You're talking about literally down to the one or two numbers on the cars and like month by month. I love it. My takeaway from that is like, if that is true, and they expand Austin's ODD, and that the ride along driver is out, which I think you talked about before, relative to where expectations have moved in the past week, meaning Uber stock was up 8% because of some of these video glitches, or excuse me, some of these initial glitches that occurred. I think that will be perceived positively for Tesla and them being back on track. Because I think that the takeaway from investors has been like, oh man, like if they're only there, this is not going to expand out of Austin. This is going to be like an Austin science project, not expanding the ODD for some extended period of time. On the flip side, obviously, if some of these glitches get worse or actually result in some accident, that injects in a greater level of uncertainty, risk, and ultimately payoff for those that are going to bet one way or another on how this goes.
To the audience, it's very important that, as Walt's right when he said you're not going to turn on a million Model Ys overnight. This is going to be a well thought out expansion with a lot of attention paid to the details at the end of the day. I do believe that they will expand faster than Waymo has because of where their technology is and how it's evolving and developing. But I want to, this is going to be a well thought out expansion with a lot of focus paid into the details.
Yeah. And again, it just goes back to how we started this segment, which is, I think when you have, some of the initial coverage and some of these people building up expectations. Oh, this is better than Waymo. Oh, they're going to turn on 1 million taxis overnight. It just builds up a false expectation. Look, Elon is in part guilty for some of this based on, some of the stuff that he tweets, but like he is a leader. You have to understand that he is setting a milestone for his internal employees and put it in that context. But in terms of, setting market expectations, I think it's quite different. And as a reminder, and I know I said this many, many times on Autonomy Markets, I mean, institutional investors are generally very skeptical about, where Tesla is paces. I know you see analysts that go on CNBC, and say certain things. They don't really, in my view, represent where the largest institutional investors' minds are at in terms of Tesla's impact and the timing of the market. And I would just direct you to where, Uber stock is today, and some of the participation, which I think is generally limited on the institutional side of things with Tesla.
You're right. Uber stock has had a great year. It's outperforming the S&P 500. It's had a great year. If the sky was falling, as some have predicted, Uber stock would not be outperforming the market. That's a very important thing to point out there, as you clearly stated.
And let's be clear, though, that Uber's future is not hinging on Tesla. Yes, I get that if Tesla is wildly successful, it could be a one guy takes everything type of market, almost like you've seen Uber today in rideshare. But I think, Uber's future probably is more hinging on which way Waymo goes, whether they maintain themselves as a partner or go a different way in terms of partnering and even just getting out of the robotaxi business altogether and licensing their technology to OEMs. And I think that's probably going to have a larger bearing on Uber's future than Tesla.
Uber has a lot of path forward. This week, they announced Atlanta, Waymo, is open for everyone. 3 days after Tesla launches Robotaxi, are we entering, it's called the ping pong phase of autonomy, where Uber makes an announcement, Tesla makes an announcement, Waymo makes an announcement. Everybody's trying to control that narrative for 24 to 48 hours.
I mean, it's possible. And by the way, the move in Uber stock this week, it was even debated among investors who trade this stuff day to day. It's like, is the move from, maybe a glitch or two that was profiled from Tesla, or was the 8% move because they finally launched and reminded people that they have this relationship with Waymo that they launched in Atlanta? So there was some debate. My personal opinion, it was probably more about some of these videos because, Waymo Atlanta was already announced. So who cares that they announced it? I mean, I think we talked about this 2 episodes ago, saying that this was imminent, right?
The ODD in Atlanta is 65 square miles. 2 key things are missing: highways and airports. Right now, the only airport that Waymo has unlocked is Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport. When do more airports start to get unlocked? Because as we've seen from TNC data, that is a massive revenue opportunity for Waymo.
My view on all this is continues to evolve. So if they're launching Atlanta, Waymo, they're satisfied with kind of how supply is cranking out from the Magna delivery. So it still might be that supply is restricting highways. I'm leaning more towards more of them getting greater comfort with the technology for the highways. But the airports are probably more in your world, Grayson, in terms of understanding when they can get through the hurdles, the regulatory hurdles to open up those airports. So what's your view there?
It should be a priority. The regulatory stuff can be worked out. Uber worked it out. Lyft worked it out. Black car service worked it out. It can be worked out. And Uber, they did a great job. They couldn't get into the Orlando airport because of a company called Mears. They basically had a de facto monopoly. So what did Uber do? They bought Mears. And then what happened? They got access to the Orlando airport. So I would say to the Waymo team, you've got the partnership for now with Uber. They have a lot of experience opening up airports. Lean heavily on them because they have the policy chops to get it done.
That statement there, Grayson, where you're saying lean on your Uber relationship in Atlanta, I think is a good segue to New York. Because last week we talked about how Uber was notably absent, in the Waymo announcement of wanting to get into New York. Now, the dialogue that I've heard subsequent to that was, okay, that's an early announcement. And if anything, this Waymo is going to need Uber because Uber has managed to be able to get into New York, which is a tough market from a regulatory standpoint. I mean, look, all bets could be off if depending on how the whole mayoral election goes in New York. But let's just put that aside for a second. Do you think Waymo is going to be driven into Uber's hands for the precise thing that you just mentioned with Atlanta? Because last week you were saying no, they can do it on their own, but now, if what you just said applies in Atlanta, like lean on Uber to get into the Atlanta airport, why wouldn't they lean on Uber and create that as a partnership for the Waymo launch in New York whenever that occurs in 2026?
They could. I'm not saying they should, but what I am saying very bluntly, Waymo needs policy help.
That's fine. So then that's kind of a modification. Sorry, Grayson, I'm holding your feet to the fire on this one. Last week, you made a big deal about saying Uber was not in that New York launch. So it sounds like maybe now you're advocating that Waymo should buddy up with Uber in order to get launched in New York. By the way, if that happened, the market reaction for Uber is going to be, I think, super positive, right? I think that validates a lot of the bull thesis that people had in terms of Waymo and Uber being longer term partners.
Yes, my thinking is changing because something happened in the market over the last week. So I'll say that something happened that is changing my thesis and outlook on that. If they did do that in New York, you're right. Uber's going to go up dramatically. Am I certain that's going to be the path? No. Is it a possibility to be a path? Yes. But what I am certain on, Waymo needs a significant amount of policy help.
Fascinating. What's also fascinating is no one's even talking about Waymo Lyft anymore. I mean, that was out there. Everyone expecting new markets and so I guess the other person Waymo could lean on in New York is Lyft because they also had to get into New York and maybe they've got some policy help. But what is going on? What do you think is going on with the Waymo Lyft connection?
A very good friend of mine, a good friend of this podcast, Pete Bigelow recently recorded a podcast with Jeremy Bird from Lyft. You can listen to the Shift podcast later today after you listen to ours. If you listen to it, Jeremy avoided the Waymo question. Pete asked him. He tried to have a Bigelow battle there, getting an answer out. Voided the answer. Lyft, as we've known, and I've tried to get it. Jeremy's been on the road to autonomy. Wanted answered. Every time somebody tries to ask a Lyft executive the Waymo question, they end up playing hopscotch around it. So what's really going on there? The fact that they won't even talk about that, I don't necessarily think that's in a very good place right now.
I mean, door number 3 here is that Waymo just gives up owning fleets altogether and, just becomes a technology company. And I think that's part of a thesis that a lot of people have. And I think was certainly, even within Waymo, there's probably people believe that. I don't know how that changes as this product moves forward. I mean, I think Google Fiber was originally thought of as something that was, trying to get competition in the market. Why? Because Google wants people to have better internet, they can use more of their services. And yet even today, Google Fiber continues to expand markets. They're not aggressive. They're not trying to be the dominant player, but they've never sold. They've never shut it down. They effectively achieve their goals, right? You have fiber build-outs from AT&T and private equity, and now T-Mobile is partnering with people. So they've achieved their goals, and yet they're continuing to expand. So I think the jury's still out on whether Waymo maintains a robotaxi fleet, over the long term. And then the secondary question there is like whether they partner, with Uber in the interim. And if they do both, then maybe Uber is still fine. Like Waymo has their own fleet, but they still get access to fleets that benefit from that technology because Waymo is going to cut deals with OEMs. So maybe there's like an answer that's in between all 3 of these alternatives.
This is a hypothetical situation. What if Waymo's robotaxi expansion is to perfect the Waymo driver, and as you said, and then pivot to a full licensing business? Then, this is a hypothetical. What if Waymo sold the robotaxi business to Uber and Waymo just kept the licensing business?
I mean, that would obviously be great for Uber. So, and I would not remove that from one of the possibilities. I know there's people out there that believe Uber does not want to own cars, and yes, long term they don't, and yes, there are going to be opportunities long term to push that off, I think, to financial partners, and I've advocated for some tax breaks that are REIT-like that you could build into that. But I think, look, in the near term, Uber's going to own cars. I think some of these deals, like they haven't detailed them yet with Wave, but I think in that situation, they're going to own those cars initially. If Nuro does a deal with him, I think that Uber, will own those cars. So, if they own that fleet and then somehow, de-risk themselves by bringing in financial partners, which I don't think is as complex as many people think, then sure, that is a potential future. And I think that would obviously be very, very positive for Uber.
No matter which way Waymo goes, it's going to have an effect on Uber one way or another. And let's not forget about Wave. Dara was in London this week. He did a panel with Alex Kendall, the co-founder and CEO. He went for a ride in the Wave vehicle. He seems to be giving him a bear hug, and that relationship is seeming to get cozier by the day.
That's definitely very fair, Grayson, that, that relationship is one. I mean, they have multiple, 15, 16, whatever the number is of relationships, but, I'm seeing Dara there, very excited. Obviously, you and I have talked about planning a trip to London later this fall to check out Wave. So definitely something to keep our eyes on as well.
Just when you thought the Autonomy Markets couldn't get more interesting, we got breaking news. Cue the music, but we don't have that type of budget. Travis Kalanick, he's back. There's a report from the New York Times, fresh off the wire here, that with Uber's financial backing, Mr. Kalanick is looking to acquire the U.S. operations of Pony.ai. That's a big move with 2 interesting bedfellows.
Well, that is definitely incredible given, Travis was at Uber. But obviously, Uber is looking to spread their technology wings at as many places as possible. And they're kind of the go-to partner now for everyone other than Tesla. So, wow, that is pretty amazing and big news. And it's going to be great to see Travis back in the game. So I know this is just, obviously, it looks like it's just speculative now, but hopefully that gets done.
You want to know the most interesting part in this deal? Pony does cars and trucks. That's another interesting element to this.
For sure. And it's great to have yet another player in the U.S. market for us to talk more about.
Do you believe, this is pure speculation because this is breaking, but do you see at some point, or do you feel at some point, that these Pony vehicles could run exclusively on the Uber network, since Uber will be potentially the financial backer of this deal?
Certainly, that's possible. They're large enough in terms of their distribution for them to do it. If they're funding it, perhaps they'd want to, as part of those term agreements, keep Lyft out. But I think in general, you probably don't want to do that. You're probably going to do better if you allow all of these technologies to flourish on multiple platforms. At this point, they have the most share. What they really need is that autonomous part of the technology stack to proliferate and to succeed, so that Tesla doesn't run away with the market, and Waymo doesn't use them to get into all these markets and use their regulatory expertise to get into all these markets and then dump them in the future.
I'm going to put on my national security hat. This is speculation, but it's a clear indicator that Pony.ai is a Chinese company. And if it is, how are you going to split the IP? That's going to get very complicated. And CFIUS is going to get involved. Is Homeland Security going to get involved? And is this only happening now because of President Trump and his policies?
I think there's been examples of companies that have done this in the past. So I don't imagine that that's going to be a large issue unless there's an interested party that's squeaky and has the president's ear.
And then another positive catalyst for Uber, we got an announcement from Foxconn. They announced a partnership with Elektrobit, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Continental, the tier one supplier, to build an electric vehicle platform, both the hardware and software. Well, what goes on top of that? An autonomy stack. There is a very clear path now where Foxconn could become a robotaxi contract manufacturer. And to further speculate, they call the platform, Walt, ready for this? EVOS. What does that sound like? An Apple product. Was Foxconn going to build the Apple car?
I don't know. Maybe we should have led with this as our first thing, with all due respect to Tesla. But this is pretty big when you're seeing yet another step in what Foxconn, can enable, and should be kind of a warning shot to the OEMs that you need to accelerate your plans with autonomous technology companies. Hello Ford, I'm talking to you. Hello GM, talking to you. Because Foxconn is coming, and if it's, especially in a robotaxi fleet where you might have specialized vehicles, this gets to like how the business model was originally written in Waymo before it was even called Waymo. Where they talked about purpose-driven vehicles. I know the guys at Nuro who are ex-Waymo have kind of said, no, we don't think that is the future for a variety of reasons that we can address offline. But I think that's still part of the plan here. And the bigger issue, Grayson, is if it's Foxconn, then you're inviting the likes of OpenAI, the likes of NVIDIA, the likes of maybe Apple, which has completely missed multiple markets, to re-enter with technology development when they can pass off hardware.
Yeah, and then you open the door to Meta, so you open the door to deep pocket tech. The Mag 7 could go into autonomy. If the Mag 7 collectively went into autonomy, the market's going to be upend itself, and you're going to have massive change, and all this competition is going to enter.
Just look at the capex that these Mag 7, other than I guess Apple, are willing to invest in AI, which many people recognize, and for good reason, is one of the biggest technology developments probably of our lifetime. Rivaling, if not maybe surpassing, the internet and the impact that's had on the economy. Autonomy is the hardware manifestation of AI, right? And you think about like, what are the models that have benefited from the internet? They've gone a lot of different ways. Apple has been one of those models that has taken a lot of value from what the mobile internet offers. So there's a lot of different ways. So as a result, I think when you look at NVIDIA, again, OpenAI, anyone with models and the dollars that are flowing there, that you have to acknowledge that there could be interest in them entering the market. Like, it gets back to how much of a advantage, does Waymo or Aurora in the case of trucking really have if you have that money and this change in technology that is pushing this forward?
The advantage is going away. AI, use of the internet, I think it's the greatest invention since the light bulb in terms of economic impact. It's going to be massive impact. The advantage that the so-called leaders have today is a disadvantage. It's going to go away because these models are changing. They're going to go mapless. NVIDIA, despite buying DeepMap and investing tens of millions of dollars in maps, is working on mapless technology. Kodiak's using mapless technology. Wave's using mapless technology. Tesla is using mapless technology. Waymo and Aurora are reliant on that. So if you look at this, I could sit here and make a very interesting argument that the Aurora Waymo approach, let's not forget Urmson came from Waymo, Google, is AV 1.0. What Wave, everybody else is building mapless with Tesla is AV 2.0 advantage. And then are the Mag 7, what they're building is that AV 3.0. And then you just see a faster acceleration in the development of that technology. And at the end of the day, you know this from your telco world, you're going to need a hardware partner. And I believe, and I truly do believe this, Foxconn views autonomy and autonomous vehicles as the next growth market for their company after the cell phone.
So I agree with that, but I do want to caveat and say just because technology has enabled new competitors to perhaps move more quickly doesn't mean that Waymo can't benefit from that. And when you relate it to my telco world, what Ericsson and Nokia and Samsung, their ability to evolve their networks with new technologies have prevented, like Amazon tried to come in and usurp the telecom infrastructure guys with, new technologies, which didn't really work. They got no traction. So just because it provides the opportunity doesn't mean that Waymo can't. And obviously, like I said earlier, Dimitri has talked about how they're benefiting from these tools. And I think part of the reason we're seeing them launch markets more quickly now is because they are also utilizing those tools. So maybe to try and continue to move forward. I just think that we just shouldn't look through the lens of how autonomy has developed over the past 10 years. We clearly have a new technology that's getting used. Maybe Waymo can sustain their advantage. I don't think we should just automatically assume that because it took them 5 to 10 years, others will take the same amount of time. And by the way, look, the benefit to Waymo could be, kind of like we've seen with Starlink, is when you're, in front, you launch markets faster, and then you start to broaden out into other markets like trucking, food delivery, like other things like that.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Waymo has, if you want to call it the rocket ship, because SpaceX has the launch vehicle to get the satellites up there. Waymo has their version of the launch ship or the rocket ship, or whatever term you want to use, with the Waymo driver that can be applied there. There's and I have a lot of friends in traditional trucking, and and you came with me to Fort Worth, hosted Mr. Perot in Fort Worth, and met a lot of them. And to this day, I was actually having a conversation this morning. We still can't get over the fact that Waymo shut down Waymo via their trucking operation. Could that ever come back, or do you think that could go back into licensing, where they just license that technology?
Yeah, of course it can come back, which is precisely what I just said in terms of they are not just because they were the leaders of, as you define it, autonomy 1.0, doesn't mean that they can't evolve and benefit from the technology of autonomy 2.0, which can manifest itself in two ways. Faster expansion in the U.S. and obviously internationally, licensing, to OEMs, and then expanding into additional verticals, whether it's trucking or specialized vehicles for food delivery or otherwise.
The specialized delivery market is growing. I've recently had the CEO of Serve Robotics on. I had the CEO of Coco Robotics, and that market is growing. The interesting thing that Zach talked about from Coco, they have a partnership with OpenAI, getting back to that, where OpenAI is using the data that Coco is gathering to train a self-driving model. Very, very interesting there. Serve Robotics has a deal with Magna where they're licensing their data to Magna, so Magna can prefer their models. You're starting to see these interesting models emerge here around data. Does data become a new revenue stream for these companies outside of licensing?
I mean, it could be a revenue stream, but I think my takeaway from that Coco comment and their relationship with OpenAI is, again, that companies like OpenAI, or as we talked about last week, Meta, could look for physical manifestations of their technology. So and by the way, we've seen OpenAI talk to Johnny Ives, and I think there's speculation about coming out with a physical phone, another manifestation, a physical manifestation of AI. So the fact that, again, I don't think some deal with Coco, no offense to Coco, is going to be the end all or break all, but it's just additional signal in the role that the new kind of tech leaders that are out there can play in this market, and how quickly they can get in there.
I highly doubt that Waymo is going to enter the delivery robot business. Yes, they have the technology, they could do it. I highly doubt them seeing it doing it. Outside of Coco Robotics, we have Serve Robotics, who's doing that this week. They're an Uber partner. They just announced an expansion to Atlanta in partnership with Uber Eats in Shake Shack. What are your thoughts on this growing autonomous bot market?
I think that's fair, Grayson. I probably got a bit carried away with my Waymo. I've just, whenever I see what Starlink has done and how they've wiped the map in terms of so many different segments, I just assume that any of these guys are going to do it. Yeah, I mean, I think, Serve is getting into new markets. Coco, we both have spent some time with. I think there's room for multiple people here. And I think as it relates to Uber, this is not one that's debatable. This is beneficial, I think, to Uber Eats in terms of lowering cost and improving reliability of delivery. So, and congrats to them, for them being Serve, and I guess Uber both, but primarily Serve for launching in Atlanta. So we're going to have to spend more time. This goes back to how you started this. We've gotten a lot of great feedback. We need to spend more time talking about other areas of autonomy, whether it's in the food delivery, trucking, or even many of the other technology partners. We got to talk about May. We talked about May a lot in past episodes. They're driver out now. We should get an update with what's going on in May as well.
We're going to get an update going on in May in the coming months because their service in Atlanta with Lyft is launching in the coming days. Now, Atlanta's emerging as an autonomy hub with Serve Robotics, Uber, Waymo, May Mobility, and soon to be Zoox operating there. Why do you think Atlanta is emerging as this autonomy hub?
I have no idea. I'm sure there's an obvious reason for that, but I just think I always kind of laugh when you say Zoox that we bring it up. It's funny because of the connection to Amazon, they're still getting a lot of play. I think there's hope that they're going to launch, I guess, in Las Vegas. I don't know. The other one I heard that kind of came up to me this week, and I was getting asked questions about is Volkswagen. I think there was something that they said, and there's some view that they're going to be in autonomy. And can you break down or translate where you think Volkswagen is in, delivering a product to the market?
Behind. There was a big press due that Volkswagen unveils the ID bus. It wasn't an unveil. It's been at CES for years. I've sat in the vehicle. I've seen it. They showed off, and maybe perhaps it's a newer designed interior, but it's all based on the Moya platform. There's nothing new there. From a stack perspective of vehicles, 13 cameras, nine LiDARs, and 5 radars. A lot of stuff's going into it. VW clearly knows how to manufacture vehicles. They know how to manufacture them at scale. Those vehicles next year will be delivered to Uber in California. Going back to what you said, we don't know who's going to own that fleet. They're going to start testing in 2026 with safety drivers behind the wheel when they commercialize. Tesla has safety attendant. VW has safety drivers. Big difference there. And then we do not have any public timeline for when they're going to go driver out. So to me, it wasn't necessarily a big announcement. It was a regurgitation of previous announcements, trying to, I would say, build buzz to take away from Tesla's robotaxi launch. Again, going back to ping pong, ping pong.
Well, that's very helpful. And for our listeners that are at these variety of companies, reach out to us. We'd definitely like to spend more time with you. Profile it on Autonomy Markets. Keep in mind, Road to Autonomy, Grayson does, new companies every week. You just, as you mentioned, Coco came out this week. I thought that was a great an interview. So there's lots of these companies that we'd like to address more and more, on the Autonomy Markets podcast, because we do believe that they have an opportunity to play a significant role. So more on that in future episodes.
Absolutely. And to the folks at VW that listen, Walt and I are happy to take a road trip to Austin to go in the Moya. We'd love to experience it, because without us experiencing it, we're just basing this off of publicly available data. But when we experience it, we're basing it off of experience and publicly available data.
We did get invited to Volvo as well, Grayson. I'm still waiting to try and head down to Volvo and check that out. Thankfully, thanks to May and Nora, we've been there, among other places, but always looking to expand our knowledge in person, to report back to our listeners.
And soon, perhaps, Walt, we'll even do a segment called Autonomy Markets, from the road or on the road. You never know, as we keep expanding. To our listeners and viewers, thanks for tuning in every week. Walt, this is your famous section. What do we need to look for in the autonomy markets over the coming week?
We need to look forward to the big, beautiful bill. I think that the target is July 4th. And I don't know, maybe there will be something in there that touches the AI or autonomy space. Otherwise, it's, I think, a relatively quiet week.
I was in DC this week, and there's a lot of buzz around the big, beautiful bill and that AI clause. To listeners and viewers, have a wonderful 4th of July. Walt and I will be back here same time every Saturday, 10 a.m. EST. The future is bright, the future is autonomous, the future is scaling. Walt, until next week.